I had just arrived in the country and it was August, and I had a couple of weeks before I had to start work. Luckily, that buffer of a few weeks allowed me to get myself sorted, get my utilities set up, my electricity set up, buy some odds and ends for my apartment, get to know where I was living, get my sleeping cycle in order. You know, I was halfway around the world, so my sleep, my circadian rhythm was totally messed up, so I had to just adjust on all levels, and it was just a new culture that I just didn't know what I was stepping into. Textbook learning didn't prepare me for that. And one day after being there for about a week or two, I heard something outside, and my apartment had very thin walls, no insulation, and I could hear a lot of what was happening outside on a regular basis. And I had heard this sound of music that I had never heard before, and I didn't know what it was, and I hear like the dee 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 dee. It was like this high-pitched flute, and then low in the distance I could hear a dum 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 boom 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 boom, and these drums of some kind, and I could hear it, and it was coming closer, and then it would stop, and it might come closer, and then it might go further away. I didn't know what it was, and you know, I a lifelong drummer, so anything musical always caught my ear, and anything that was rhythmic, I was very intrigued, and it didn't sound like a drum set, that's for sure. So I was curious, so I slid open my balcony window and I looked out, thought, maybe it's somebody's car, or they're listening to something in their house, like a stereo, and it's floating down the alley towards where my apartment building was. And then I heard it again, much clearer this time. And I didn't know what it was. And I thought, okay, I've just got to wait till it gets closer, or I've got to go out and find what's going on here. And it got closer, and it seemed like it was coming down the alley/road that my apartment was on. I lived in an area where there wasn't a lot of traffic. There was no reason for anyone to be on my road unless they lived there, and there weren't that many houses. And the road was more like a single lane alleyway/road, which was pretty common in that area. They weren't like definitive roads with sidewalks and medians and lines. It was just these snaking little throughways. And all of a sudden, into visual distance comes a group of locals, you know, sweating, because it's hot in the summertime there. It's jungle hot. They've got their hand towels wrapped up as bandanas to soak up the sweat. And I always was envious of that because their heads were small enough to wrap a hand cloth around it. I've got a big fat skull, so I could never do that. I would always try, and I couldn't do it because my head was too big. What a great sweatband they had. And there they were. A group of guys and a couple of gals. A little ragtag, not a marching band, but a ragtag of moving musicians. There was the flute player that I had heard, then I could see the drums. There was a bigger drum, and there was smaller drums. These guys were carrying them, and they'd stop, and they'd place them down, and they'd continue playing again. And there was an older gentleman with looked like a brass plate or a bronze plate or a bowl, and he'd hit it with like a brass mallet, and it was a metronome of sorts. It was really high pitched, so it would cut through all the noise. And I guess he was the timekeeper. I don't know. I didn't know who these people were or what they were doing, and at the same time, I was their biggest fan. I was so fascinated with what I was seeing. They passed by, and I was mesmerized. I didn't know what I had just seen. And that haunting song they'd play over and over again, and it was so fascinating, and even today, I can't get it out of my mind. It was awesome. So fast forward a week later, a local guy in the town who had already been living in the town before me, Tim, from Canada, said, "Hey Brendan, I know you've been here for a short amount of time. The Gion Festival is this weekend. The Gion Matsuri. Matsuri is festival." He said, "Do you have plans to go to the Matsuri?" And I said, "No, I didn't even know about it. I don't really know anybody here. I don't know anything about what's happening. I was just glad that he reached out. Having a conversation with another foreigner was great, and having a conversation with anybody there was great. I was feeling pretty lonely, like a man isolated. And I said, well, why don't you join us? There's going to be a group of us that are meeting down there. I said, fantastic, let's do it. He said, do you know where this junction is in the main part of the town? I said, I think I can find it. And he's like, okay, meet us there. He's like, you can't miss us because it's going to be me and a couple other foreigners and some Japanese people, and we're going to be the only other foreigners you're going to see. I said, okay. And he was right. The day came, I went over, and there was Tim. You know, he's over 6 feet tall, blonde Canadian guy, so clearly he was the guy who I had spoken to on the phone. And the festival was fantastic. Not only was there the band that I saw, there were other musicians, other bands from other districts in the town. So apparently the way the town had been laid out, there were, I guess, neighborhoods or regions, and our town was an agricultural town, and it was very expansive. And so people were spread out across the area. There weren't a lot of high concentrations of neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods apparently would battle. They'd have their own flautists and their own drummers and their own dancers, and they would march around the town. I don't know if they had a pre-planned route, but people were marching around, and it seemed like the whole town was out. The sun was down, and the streets were flowing with families and kids and people, and everybody was still hot and sweaty, and it didn't matter, and people were drinking beer, and people were drinking sports drink and water. It was just so different for me, being fresh to the country, and I was just elated. I was so excited. There was no violence. People were drinking out in public. There was no screaming at each other. There was no violence. There was no trash. I didn't know, I had no idea that this could even exist. And the night went on, and the night went on, and the battles continued. And as it went down, I asked Tim, I said, Tim, what is the Gion Matsuri? Like, why are they having this festival? Is this common? He said, no, this is the harvest festival for the region. And as you know, there's a lot of rice farming and radish farming here. And this is a festival that's been happening for hundreds, 1,000 years all across Japan. Harvest festival to celebrate a good harvest. I thought, wow, this is so lucky for me to be experiencing something like this. So it was a first time for me. We wrapped up that night, and I then became fascinated with taiko drumming. I didn't know much about taiko drumming before. I had heard about it, of course, being a drummer, but I didn't really know anything about it. I didn't have any real plans of studying it. However, it was seeing those drummers using the smaller taiko drums, smaller versions, that got me really excited about learning more about it and how it was different and why it was different. And it was that night that got me hooked on this traditional rhythm pattern and songs that were so unique to that country that I had no idea about. And even since, I've tried to find audio clips of that type of song that's, I think, is a very common song they play at those types of festivals. I still haven't been able to find it. However, it still plays in my mind, and I can recite it note for note out loud, and just it gets me excited just thinking about it and hearing myself sing the melody. And you know, for me, the Gion Matsuri and meeting up with Tim and meeting a couple of other foreigners that lived in neighboring towns and villages was a good path beyond for me. I wasn't feeling all that social. I was feeling a little bit isolated. I was going through a little bit of separation anxiety of leaving my home country and landing in this new country and just hitting the ground running. And the prospect of going out and meeting a bunch of strangers was exciting, yet it was a little bit daunting. And you know, it was definitely a path beyond for me, culturally, environmentally, and just emotionally. Meeting those people, meeting Tim, who would become a dear friend and still is a dear friend, and learning from him and learning from the local town and experiencing them welcoming me, the foreigner, the new guy, in with open arms. It was really great. I think that was a great little journey for me, and a fun story that I wanted to share with you. here on Paths Beyond, because that's really what it's about. Going beyond where we would normally go and telling those stories about those journeys. See you next time.